The earth was thus surrounded by waters above and below. That does seem to be the conception of the world and the structure of the world that the ancient Israelites would have shared. Yes, there is a question in the back, and the microphone is right behind you. So your second question is easy because we're about to go through that. So just hang on for 1 minute. Your first question is actually a very interesting one, because if you look at some of the passages that I was taking you to, they are poetic passages, right? So there very well may be, in fact, a mix of poetry and simile and metaphor that is not to be taken strictly literally. Although, if you think about it, for those metaphors and similes to make sense, there has to be an underlying view that is at least consistent with them, right? So to talk about foundations, right, that doesn't make sense unless there is some conception that there really is a foundation under the earth that's holding it. The references to the waters, there are enough of them in enough context that it's pretty clear that the view of the ancient Israelites off in your ear. There has to be some underlying concept that's very similar to what you see here. But let's actually go directly to the other views, because there's a remarkable, what I want you to do when we go through this discussion now is think about what's similar to what the ancient Israelites thought based on what I think has been going on. What is similar, and then what is different, right? So be sensitive to similarities and differences as we go through this discussion. And we'll start actually with ancient Egypt. And you won't find any of this material in the outline. There are a couple of pictures that I threw in. I started out actually writing it down and outlining it, and then decided that I didn't really need to do that, because I don't really care about the minutia, because it's the big picture that hopefully you'll get very quickly. So let's start with Egypt here. The ancient Egyptian creation myth, and I apologize, this is very bad PowerPoint form, but I'm just going to read these slides because they get it very nicely. In ancient Egypt, there were many accounts of the creation of the world, but in all the accounts, the world was said to have arisen out of the infinite lifeless waters of chaos in the first occasion. Important part of the ritual that the sun rises over the circular mound of creation as goddesses pour out the primeval waters around it. Okay, remember similarities and differences. There's very much a coincidence, at least in part. But now, let's look at their story. In one version of the Hermopolitan cosmogony, in which the ancient Egyptians believed, and here's now the story of the Egyptian creation myth. The god Atum mated with his own hand, thus creating the two children, Shu and Tephanet, who were personifications. Shu personified as the air, and his sister Tephanet associated with moisture. Shu and Tephanet then bore two other deities, right? So already, again, remember similarities and contrast? Should be some major contrasts and differences that you're picking up on here. they bore two other deities, Geb and Nut. The picture shows Shu holding up Nut, the sky goddess above Geb, the earth god. It was believed that Geb and Nut were originally locked together in a close embrace, but their father Shu divided them, thus giving Nut her place as the arch of heaven and leaving Geb to become the physical earth. So Shu himself became between the heaven and the earth. Here's another picture of it. You see, which I've kind of marked for you. So Shu is in the middle, and he's holding up Nut. The blue arch, right, is Nut, and Geb is the earth. And then in this picture, actually, which wasn't marked in the previous slide, there's a guy in a boat, and he's actually sailing over the sky. That's the sun god Ra, and he's floating on the heavenly Nile. Now, step back, kind of unfocus your eyes, look at this picture, and I think you're going to see that it looks very similar to the conception of the ancient Israelites, at least as to the basic structure, right? And what we care about here are similarities and differences, okay? Let's now move across the Fertile Crescent. We'll head for Mesopotamia. Here's the Babylonian mythology. The Babylonians believed there were two gods in the beginning. So their story starts with two gods governing the bodies of chaotic water. Similarities and differences, right? Water there, but now two gods, right? Apsu over fresh water and his wife Tiamat over salt water. Okay, so we've got two gods, fresh water and salt water. And in the beginning, Apsu and Tiamat were the only beings around. And when they mingled their waters together, the fresh and the salt, nothing existed before these chaos gods. So this is what the Babylonian creation epic, which is called a Numa Elish, says. When in the height, where it's not named, and the earth beneath did not bear a name, and the primeval Apsu, one of the gods who begat them, and Chaos Tiamat, the mother of them, both brought their waters and mingled them together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. When on the gods, none had been called into being, and none bore a name, and no destinies were created. Then they created all the gods. And then the story moves on. It's kind of interesting the way they put this slide together. A rather wild kind of woman and was often labeled as chaos or total nuttiness in the universe where nothing makes sense. However, it was the great hero Marduk who killed Tiamat and put the world in order. Actually, if you look at the outline, that little picture under Mesopotamia, that's actually a relief of Babylon. And it's a picture of Tiamat and Marduk, which you'll also see on the screen. Marduk was a god, and what happened is that Marduk sliced up the body of the monster Tiamat in a major battle that they had, and then Marduk took the various pieces of Tiamat's body and used them to make all of the structures of the earth. So the Babylonian universe was a three-tier structure with a flat earth floating on waters under the heaven. Actually, there's a picture on this slide of a tablet, actually, an ancient stone carving that they found that shows you this picture. Look at that picture. Does that look familiar? How many times have we seen it? Right? It's very much similar to both the Israelite conception and the Egyptian conception, because they're all operating with the basic same understanding of the universe in a physical sense. But again, remember what we're looking for are differences. And the differences are extraordinary as well, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. You might remember that back when we were talking about the 6 days of creation, I told you that there was an emerging view that in this story of creation and in Genesis 1, what we have is God not attempting to correct the cosmology of the ancient Israelites. Instead, he was teaching them about himself. Here's a statement of this view, which I want you to think about as I read through it, and accounts of cosmic and human origins in the language and conceptual categories of the ancient Israelite authors of the Bible. These texts should not be removed from their ancient context and read as if they describe cosmic or human origins in 21st century scientific terms. They speak in terms of an ancient Near Eastern perception of the world and should be interpreted within that setting. When we discern the meaning of the text in their ancient context, we find that they constitute a worldview statement about God and his relationship to the world, and about humans and their relation to God and the world. This basic worldview statement transcends its ancient cultural setting and commands the attention of God's people in all places and all times. So what are those authors basically saying? What they're saying is that you can read Genesis 1, and actually the first several chapters of Genesis, understanding that they shared a conception of the physical world and the way it worked with everyone around them, among other reasons because they weren't in a position to understand anything else, right? They didn't have telescopes. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't even have eyeglasses, for that matter. So all they had was their perception. But what's important is where Genesis differs from the ancient creation stories we see in other places. So there is an underlying similarity in terms of the physical understanding of the way the universe works, but there's a very different, extraordinarily different understanding of what's really going on, okay? Now, could God have revealed to the ancient Israelites a structure of the universe that's more consistent with our modern understanding? Of course. Had he wanted to do that? Would that have worked? That's a very interesting and very different question. You know, first of all, we're not really sure even today exactly what our scientific understanding of the world is, but it's certainly very different than the ancient Egyptians. But if God had said to the ancient Israelites, if God had said to the Israelites, the earth is a globe, the earth is surrounded by an atmosphere, and the cosmos is enormous with galaxies, billions of galaxies, all of which I've created and controlled, would that have made any sense to the ancient Israelites? That's a very interesting question. It would have read like apocalyptic literature. It would have read like science fiction. It would have been, you know, isn't that interesting? But where did that come from? We know what the world is and how it works. And it's not what was just revealed to us. Just think about that. But let me just say this fairly bluntly. I don't particularly care whether you believe that the earth was created in 6 literal days or it took millions of years. That's not the real issue. What I think is the real issue is what makes Genesis different. And it's extraordinarily different when you think about those creation myths that we just looked at from other civilizations. Genesis is very clear that there's only one God, pre-existent, all-powerful creator, right? God was not created. He wasn't born by the action of other deities. Right? He didn't create other sub-deities to make the world to help shape it. Instead, we know, Genesis makes very clear that God created everything. And it's also very clear from Genesis that creation is not divine, right? Creation is not a collection of gods personified. It's not a god of the earth and a god of the sky. It's very different. This is still relevant today. There are people today that still see creation as having some divine aspect to it, but that's not what Genesis teaches us, right? And this is why in this statement here, I think it's so important to focus on the worldview, and what Genesis really wants us to understand, which is that the all-powerful, all-wise, all-loving God created everything for his own purposes, that God is the one that brings light and order, right? And creation is good, right? It's an extraordinarily different conception of the universe, and it's going to become very important for us when we, in just a week or two, start to talk about the special place of humans in creation. Because we have a, yes, Becky.
What makes sense to me is if you are willing to study the Bible like as a real student, what makes sense to me if you put Genesis next to all of these other cultural beliefs about creation, and you kept using the word chaos, 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 is that the God that we see in Genesis reduces chaos.
It reduces chaos to
Cuts through
cuts through
chaos.
the noise and the interference.
Cuts through the chaos, and it makes it as understandable as our minds can conceive.
Yes,
And if we also believe that Moses was divinely inspired to write it down, and he cut through the chaos as well, and gave us a fairly short description that God is more interested in the people, ultimately, than he is in the everything else.
yes, absolutely. It's the order that he's bringing and his view of the world. Yes, in the back, and then, oh, well, Doug, take the microphone to the back first, and then you can use it yourself. You don't have it?
Well, I physically do.
Well, just speak up then, and then we'll take the other question. Go ahead.
To build off what Becky was saying, I think there's another outtake from this. You have this great slide that says what makes Genesis different. I could envision another slide that says, what does this tell us about the character of God? And to me, one of the most important things that just goes through all of Scripture is God is the creator. And because he created things, what does that tell us about his character? It tells us that he is omniscient and he is omnipotent, that he loves us, that he is a God of order, that he cares about us, that he's in control. I mean, you could extrapolate all these things that when you look at him as creator and just unpack all of what that means, to me that leads to a world view that
Amen. Yes, that's exactly the point. And he happened to communicate it in a language and a structure that made sense to these people. But what you said is, I think, what he really wanted to tell them. So that's why I say you can believe whatever you want about how long the days were in Genesis and things. What's really important is what you just said. Doug, did you want to add something? Or?
I just wanted to clarify that God did not have to cut through any chaos. God created it all, and it was good. Right? The chaos didn't come until sin.
There was chaos in the sense of lack of order, right? So when Genesis 1 begins, there was the primeval waters that he worked with, used, was not intimidated by, was not a problem for him. And he's bringing order. He's organizing things. Tim, quickly, do you want to? Because if we have time, we might play hiding again. My wife says no. Sorry, you're going to have to listen to it this afternoon at home. Go ahead, Tim. Doesn't anybody want to? Never mind. Tim, go ahead.
Just a real quick question. So thank you for laying all of this out. And I echo the statement that, Calvin said one time, God lists when he talks to us. He can't understand how the world was created. He had to speak in, so to speak, baby talk to these people of Israel about
I don't think there are quote-unquote dangers. I actually happen to think that properly read, Genesis 1 thinks the world was created in 6 days. I actually think it's important, particularly for our understanding of God's rest and the Sabbath, to understand that there's something being said to us about the 6 days of creation. But I also personally happen to think that the 6 days doesn't completely make sense, because when you look at day 1 and day 2, we know that the light that we see in the night sky has been coming to us for millions of years. We know that our understanding of the shape of the earth and the atmosphere is very different than what the ancient Israelites thought. So my own view is that what Genesis is telling us is that it was 6 calendar days that the Lord did all of this, and that relates to the command to honor the Sabbath. But all of that is simply accommodating the ancient understanding of the physical world, as opposed to what I've been trying to get us all to focus on, which is what's different, what sets what I think is the truth apart from what the ancient peoples thought. And it has nothing to do with science, because they weren't capable of coming to any conclusions about science, but it relates very directly and continues to be extremely relevant to our understanding of our worldview and who God is and what he requires of us and our place in creation. So, okay, so the question is now the hermeneutics and how we understand 6 days. I think we may need to come back to this. Personally, again, you have to, I think, differentiate between the physical attempt to describe a world that the Israelites would have understood and known versus what's really being said. And I actually think the 6 days are 6 days, literal or calendar days, because that's the only thing that makes sense of the Sabbath and Exodus. But that's then not saying to me anything at all about the science of creation, which I think can, be allowed to be whatever we discover. And we haven't figured it out yet, right? I mean, that's the really interesting thing about this. If you think God should have told us the way it really happened, he would probably have had to tell us something that even we have not yet established, right? So it's a really interesting problem of how to deal with all of this. We really run over at this point, but thank you all. We'll come back to all of this, and if you have anything in particular that you want to hear about that we've kind of glossed over, let me know, and we'll come back. All right, thanks. We need to break.